All right, so let's get started to make sure that we don't run behind schedule time. So, welcome everyone. This is a first run with component theming, as soon as I find my clicker. And so how I like to start talks is I want to hear why you're here today. So I want to know what it is about this talk, or what questions you have, or what issues you're running into. Why is it that this talk was interesting to you today? What got you here? Go.
I recently started working with Pattern Lab.
You recently started working with Pattern Lab. Awesome.
Breaking things into components. I'd like to compare how you're doing it in Drupal with what Pattern Lab is doing.
You're going to like this talk.
Okay, great.
All right. I hope. I hope.
Similar thing as atomic design.
Atomic design and Pattern Lab.
With that.
There has never been a time where asking starting questions at first hasn't worked out. Yes, go ahead.
Yep, same deal. Building out a pattern library with Pattern Lab, you can see how it is.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone else? Any other different? I'm hearing Pattern Lab and Atomic Design.
That's the word theme.
Which is fantastic. Theme in the title. Nice. Awesome. Very good. Okay. Good. So actually, booked like 2 more minutes for questions. Anybody else? We're going to go ahead of schedule. I like it. All right. Very good. So just so you guys know, the slides are available online. Okay. And you can download the entire theme that we're going to talk about today. So I exported what we're going to talk about today. Just in a second, we'll get into it. But basically what I did was I used Pattern Lab and Atomic Design to build my own business site this past fall. So this is generally what we're going to talk about today. So my goals, thank you for sharing your goals. Your goals and my goals align today. Another one of my goals is we're going to move really fast. Okay? So the goal here is, for me, is I want to make sure this stuff is available for you so that you can go and take a look at it at your own pace, on your own time, after this is done. And you can, of course, do it while we're talking as well, right? So my goal here is to share with you the overarching high-level concepts, make sure that we're communicating those clearly, and then I'm also going to give you some code examples. But those code examples are really going to be there so that you can then take them and start to play with them and work with them after this session is done. So I don't want you to feel as though you have to write down all the code, because you absolutely do not. All this code is going to be completely and 100% available to you. And it is right now. This is available, and this is available online publicly, even though I'm running it locally. Okay? So this is my high-level goal, which is I have built one theme in a component way. I've built a lot of themes in a non-component way, right? Which was part of the frustration and part of the challenge. And part of some of the problems that I wanted to overcome using component theming. But this is where I am right now. So I've done one, and so I'm really close to the beginner. I remember all the beginner stuff because it was just a couple of months ago, right? And so what I want to do is try to help pave over some of those hurdles that I ran into, so that the things that took me a couple of weeks maybe take you a couple of days, and then you can go spend a couple of weeks on something else. And then whenever you spend those couple of weeks, write about it online and let me know so I can learn from what you guys are doing too. Okay? So cool. All right, so my name is Levi Sigworth. And there are a couple ways that you can reach me. First is, I run my own small company, and by small I mean very small, which is me. The whole company's here. If the plane goes down, the company's dead, right? So that's me. You can also reach me online at Drupal. So I've been at Drupal.org. So I've been a member, I think, since 2011. I started playing with Drupal the day that Drupal 7 came out. So and I used to be here. This used to be home base for me. I live in Utah right now, but this used to be home base, so I'm really happy. I'm really happy to be back, and I'm really happy to see all your faces. And finally, you can reach me on Twitter as well. Cool. So why listen to what I have to say? Well, there are a couple of things that I want to bring up. And the first is that for me, the reason why I like open source so much is that there are so many examples that are available publicly. In the same way that I'm making examples to you, other people have made examples to me. And so what I do is I take those examples and I learn from them, and I try to figure out what works. I try to figure out what doesn't work for me, right? And then I go and try to see if I can accomplish my goals with what I'm doing. So hopefully that's the first thing is like I'm doing what the community has done for me, and hopefully I'm doing that back for you. The most important thing is, though, what I've done has worked for me. I do not think that there is one true way to do what I'm doing. I think there are high-level goals that we can all go after as front-end developers, but I don't think that there's one true way to make this happen. Fortunately, I've heard a lot of people talk about Pattern Lab and atomic design today. That's what we're going to talk about, okay? But I don't want you to get too bogged down in saying Pattern Lab is the absolute way to go, right? We're going to focus on the high-level concepts, and then and then after that, we're going to take a look at an implementation. That implementation happens to be Drupal 8 Pattern Lab in this example. All right. So goals of this project. So this is the #1 goal of this project, and I want to spend a little bit of time here because this is the thing that I'm going after. It doesn't matter about Pattern Lab, it doesn't matter about Drupal 8. This is the #1 concept, which is to improve the design in the browser and not in a Photoshop rendering. Okay? Photoshop renderings, a high-resolution Photoshop rendering, in my opinion, and I'm putting my stake in the ground, and this is where I'm choosing to fly my flag. Okay? In my opinion, it does not benefit 3 groups of people. The first group it's not fair to are designers. And you would think, well, that doesn't make sense. Designers use Photoshop all the time, right? Sure, fine. But it's not fair to designers because it doesn't introduce all of the variability of creating a responsive site in Photoshop, right? So #1, I think that Photoshop is not fair as a final client deliverable. And I want to make sure that I'm putting that giant parentheses around there as a final client deliverable. It is not what the thing that makes sense for designers to be able to truly explore all of the variations of what responsive design gives us. The second group that it's not fair to is front-end developers. Why? Because if the designers haven't had the opportunity to go through all those experiences, the front-end developers will have that opportunity. And if those ideas haven't been thought out and worked on and iterated on, the front-end developer is going to be either in a position of dealing with it on their own, right? Or dealing with it in a way and implementing something that perhaps the designer didn't want, right? We've all been there. I can't tell you the number of times when I've made a decision and it wasn't what the designer had intended, and that caused conflict. And what we want to try to do here is reduce conflict and increase the quality of our work. But there is a third group, and I think this is the most important group where high-res Photoshop mockups do not work for as a final client deliverable, and that is the client themselves, right? The client is paying us as experts in this field, regardless of how we might personally feel if we're an expert, right? To the client, we are. And the client is paying us not for a picture of a website. The client is paying us for a website itself. And it is our responsibility as experts in this field to deliver the right product that meets the needs of the client. How many in here have bought a car before? Okay, awesome. What did you do after maybe you researched it online, right? But in order to make your final decision on what was right about the car, what did you do to it?
Test drive.
Exactly, right? You went out and you took that car out for a spin. How many have chosen not to buy a car because of a test drive? Right? Absolutely. And I'm sure that you have chosen to buy a car because of a test drive as well. We would never buy a picture of a car and spend $30,000 on that, and yet that's exactly what we ask our clients to do. There are perhaps a few of us, maybe Steve, right, who is a mechanic and who understands cars. But I would bet the vast majority of us are not experts in the theory of cars. Or maybe in the theory, but we're experts in the driving of cars, but we're not experts in cars themselves. I'm certainly not. So what we do is we go and test drive it and we figure out what works for us and what doesn't. This is exactly the same thing that we need to be doing for our clients, creating actual deliverable websites to them so that they can figure out what works, what doesn't, and how can we iterate and improve on those things. This is the core driving principle of what I'm going after. That's why I go after these technologies and see if they can work for me. Okay? And I'm hoping that I can smooth out some barriers and get them working for you as well. All right, so these are just some of the things that Photoshop cannot do that websites can. Are there any others that pop off in any of your minds, something that stands out?
Run JavaScript.
Run JavaScript? That's a great one. Yep, exactly. Anything else Photoshop can't do that websites can?
Can't test in different browsers.
Can't test in different browsers. Good one. Very good. Excellent.
Fail against CSS.
Fail to load CSS? Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. And these are cases that we have to deal with, right? 100%. Awesome. Awesome. All right. So this is the second goal that I have. Now we're going to move through the goals a little bit more quickly because I've gotten off my soapbox, right? So all right. So front-end style guide that's perfectly in sync with production. So what is a front-end style guide? Some of you mentioned Pattern Lab, right? Pattern Lab is an implementation of a style guide, but generally a style guide is a website that represents all the parts of your site, and something that loads into the browser in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and then something that we can then test and iterate on. Okay? So what I wanted to create was a front-end style guide system, and I chose Pattern Lab to do it, that drives how my site looks and how my site interacts. But I wanted that to actually then directly apply to Drupal 8. And the cool thing about it is now we can actually do that with Drupal 8, and we'll get into what we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk is how do we actually make that connection happen, okay? So on a high level, here's how we're going to do it. We have a theme, and inside of that theme, we have Pattern Lab files, we have Drupal theme files, and we have a folder called dest, which is going to output CSS and JavaScript, some icons and those other things. So all of these items are going to be shared in one Drupal theme. Okay? So we have one Drupal theme that is actually making up two systems. That one theme, on one hand, you have a Pattern Lab system that sits on inside of that folder and is going to be run independently. Okay? And then on the other side, you have the Drupal 8 theme, and the Drupal 8 theme is going to talk over to Pattern Lab and make that connection. So this is on a really high level. There are tons of other files and folders in here. I don't want to give the impression that this is as simple as it gets, because it isn't. But these are the most important high-level parts whenever we're first starting to take a look at this. So we have one Drupal theme that's going to be composed of two systems, and we're going to make those two systems work with each other. And then the final goal that I have is to publish the front-end style guide publicly. Why would I want to do this? Well, it shows that I can do it, right? And I think that it works to attract the type of clients that I'm looking to gain, and perhaps clients are looking for somebody who has the skills that I'm looking for as well. Okay, good. So I'm way behind. So how are we going to do this? We're going to reach these with component theming in Drupal 8. So why component theming? Because it's going to be a lot of work, right? And this is more work than if we just take what Drupal gives us out of the box. So we're going to, the advantage of component theming is we're going to make changes to the part of the site, exactly the part of the site that you want. We're going to be able to roll those out in a predictable manner. Okay? So that's what we're doing. I'm sure that we've all seen examples of this CSS joke. This is my favorite CSS joke in the entire world, which is two CSS properties walk into a bar, and a bar stool in a completely different bar falls over. Right? We've done that where we try to make something a change in the footer, and we change part of the CSS, and it's CSS that either we didn't write or we wrote it 6 months ago. Right? And we don't remember what we did and why we did it. And now we've introduced a change in the header when all we wanted to do was the thing in the footer. Right? That's the kind of thing that we're going to try to fix with component theming. So what is component theming? It's bundles of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, little tiny packages that are going to be used to build out your site. Think of your site as perhaps Legos. And we're going to take all these little packages, we're going to build other things, and we're going to hook those all together, and that's going to be your entire site. All right, so let's take an example of what we're going to do. We're going to walk through 3 examples today, and they're each going to increase in complexity a little bit. The first one is, these are all examples that are available on my live site, okay? And we're going to start actually with the already generated example, and then we're going to work backwards, because I want us to all know what are we going after, what are our goals, what are we trying to get to. So here's the very first component that we're going to take a look at, which is the ability to show an example piece of code on a site. Okay? So we have 2 parts here. The first part right here is where we show the code example, and the second part is down here where we put a little bit of a description below it. You can ignore this part up here. This is just content that would actually be in the text component above it. Okay? So with this component, we have just these 2 pieces. And what we're going to do is we're going to build out, I'll show you here an example. We're going to build these out in Pattern Lab, and then we're going to hook them up to Drupal 8. So let's take a look at the final generated HTML so that we know what it is that we're going to be, what the browser is ultimately going to receive. So this is the final generated HTML. That's the entirety of it. You see, we're not making any assumptions based on where this thing lives. This thing is one compartment, it's completely self-contained, and we can move this thing around to any other part of the website. And we're going to know that it's always going to look exactly the same. So what we've done here is namespace this area. So we have paragraphs code, that's the name of this block. And I don't want you to think blocks in terms of Drupal blocks, just blocks in terms of a block, a section of markup that we're working with here. And inside of it, we have our two pieces. We have our two elements. So we have our namespace block, and then underscore underscore element, and then two more elements down here. We have caption, and inside of that we have text. So this is our final generated HTML. This is what it's gonna take a look like. And then these, of course, will get replaced by what actually is the content. I'm sorry, that we want to output. The final generated CSS is going to look very, very flat. And that's one of the most important things about this naming structure, is that we're going to have very flat CSS. So we have a namespace here with paragraphs code. And you'll see even here, it's not even nested inside, right? Paragraphs code, dash dash code lives by itself right there. So, very, very flat CSS. This CSS makes no assumptions, and that's the most important part. It doesn't assume that the CSS lives inside of the sidebar or the footer or the header. It lives, all we worry about is what's available in that one little component right there. And no JavaScript for this widget. In fact, none of the widgets we're going to take a look at today contain JavaScript. It just wasn't a need, right, for what I needed. In this build, I was both the client and the developer, which led to some very interesting conversations. But I mean, nonetheless, the client side of me had no need for these particular widgets for JavaScript. Okay, so we're gonna, for the rest of the talk, we're just gonna pretend that JavaScript doesn't exist.
So
Go ahead.
is that generally true for this approach? You're going to be minimizing the use of JavaScript, or?
It's not intentional. It's just that for these examples, it's just content that I'm putting onto the page. Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's an intentional try to get around JavaScript. Yeah. Yep. All right. So, quick break number one. Another one of my goals for today was to make sure to introduce advanced concepts, but I want to make sure that I don't make any assumptions about what technologies you've interacted with. Okay, so we're going to take a couple breaks in between showing these examples to make sure to review the buzzwords that I just introduced. Okay, so the very first one is front-end style guide. This is the thing that I'm making the argument replaces the final high-res mockups in Photoshop. This is the website of examples and components that we're going to put together, and this is the final client deliverable that the client approves and gets to interact with in a browser. All right. So this is my argument is what replaces Photoshop. Pattern Lab and Atomic Design. This was my implementation of how I chose to implement. My implementation of a front-end style guide. These are the tools that I chose to use in order to make this happen. All right. So let's take a look at that first component that we just worked through, and we're gonna deconstruct it. So we've seen what the end goal is. We see what it looks like, what the HTML and CSS is that we want to show. Now let's work the whole way back to the beginning of the process and work our way back to being able to meet those goals. All right. So once again, let's take a look and review. And we have the two parts. We have the example code, and we have the description here at the bottom. Okay. So step one is to understand that there is a need for a component. I'm going to come back to this over and over and over. This is, in my opinion, this is the most important goal. Everything else after this is implementation details. So it really requires system-level thinking. So what is the mini system that we want to build here with the code example? What are the parts that this system contains?
Code and caption.
Code and caption. Very good. Excellent. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the code and caption, the mini system, as a component into Pattern Lab. So a Pattern Lab item, and Pattern Lab has its own terminology, and you can change this terminology if it doesn't work for you. But it has this idea of atoms, molecules, and organisms. And so think of those as like the nesting blocks, the Russian nesting dolls that we keep on adding more parts together. And I'll show you an example of it here in just a second. Okay. These are the parts that it's made up of HTML, CSS, a JSON file that shows the example content, and this is an important thing that Photoshop can't do, which is to give example and real content in a Pattern Lab. Okay. a Markdown file which just shows the usage documentation, and then of course JavaScript as well. So let's take a look at an example pattern lab really quickly. So this is the one that's available publicly online. Sean, I told you it was all local. I'm wrong. This is the one thing that's not local. So this is an example pattern. This is an example pattern lab implementation. And what you'll see here is it starts here at the top. You have all the little pieces. And as you scroll down through, you can see all the little pieces start to come together to build parts. So let's take a look, for example, maybe right here, right? So this is an organism of all these parts that are being started to put together. What's really cool is now we can take all those and make an example site. And so let me show you a couple quick parts of Pattern Lab that I think are a lot of fun. You can resize it right in the browser and see what happens. You can test your examples. This is my personal fun, which is if you're really feeling ambitious, you can just let it go all the time, right? This will trust me, this will find problems in your implementation. And that's what we want to do, is we want to find problems early before we start to implement it in Drupal.
Does it stop when it finds a problem?
No, it's up to you to spot the problem. It doesn't have an understanding of when your content breaks. So let's take a look at this same one with real content piped into it, right? It doesn't understand when it is that your content breaks. And only you as the designer, only you as the front-end developer can work on these things and understand, and along with the client, to understand where the content is no longer working, right? So that's what's really cool about this, is you actually get the opportunity to test real content. That's something that we don't get to do with Photoshop unless it's it's more work than this is, trust me. Okay? There's one final thing that I think is really cool that it's really hard for me to demo here, which is when you spin up Pattern Lab, you get two URLs. The first one is this is what we're going to take a look at on my Pattern Lab, but you also get an external URL. If you're on the same network, you can take another one of your devices and point it to that URL, and then when you scroll here, it scrolls on your device without you touching it. It's pretty cool, right? So you could have a whole mess of video and just do once. It's really strange. I would sometimes like grab my phone and go sit on the couch and play with it, and then look up at my screen, right? And it was moving. It was weird. So, but that's really cool. All right, so that's a quick run with Pattern Lab. We're gonna take a look at specific ones here in a second. All right, where did I put my clicker? All right, good. So let's start. That's a lot of files to take a look at, and fortunately you don't have to remember all of them. So there's a command that Pattern Lab Starter uses, and Pattern Lab Starter is what I've chosen to implement this with Drupal theme. So Phase 2 did a default Drupal theme, not a default, a starting point Drupal theme that you can use that makes this, they've set up a lot of the default integration for you, which makes life a little bit easier. And so one of the commands that comes there with npm run new, that allows you to create a new part of Pattern Lab. And it'll walk you through and it'll ask you about all those different files. Do you want to create a JSON file? Do you want to create a JavaScript file? Those types of things. So the key thing here is there are things that help you out. So let's take a look at the Twig markup of this paragraphs code. So the first thing that we have here, you'll notice that we have the namespace paragraphs-code, and we have the section right here. This is where we start to name. We give the element grouping for code, and then this is our Twig element that just outputs what we define as the code variable, and then the same thing down here. We output the caption as well. So that's the Twig markup. Again, this all lives in Pattern Lab. The SCSS file. So this is a Sass file. We're only going to create a little bit of Sass to be able to talk directly with this component, and we're going to bundle all these things together. So that way, whenever one of our goals is to make consistent and predictable changes, but only to the area that we want to control. So that SCSS file lives with this little chunk of work. And whenever we know we make changes here, we only affect that little bit because we have namespaced everything with this paragraphs-code. If you're new to Sass, we're not actually writing CSS right here. We're writing Sass, and Sass will then get compiled out to the final CSS file that is shared with both Pattern Lab and with Drupal 8. The important thing here is paragraphs-code. Anytime there's an ampersand, Sass goes ahead and generates that final CSS for us, so it replaces it and makes life just a little bit easier. And here's the JSON file. It's just example content. that we're going to show. So step 3 is test the pattern in the browser. This is the next part that I feel is exceptionally important, where it's very difficult, I would say awfully impossible, to be able to test a Photoshop design in the browser and change it and move things around and see what happens, but we can absolutely do it with Pattern Lab. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to take our pattern and test it. So let's take a look at the pattern as I've defined it. So we have a paragraphs code, and we have it right here, so we can start to test these things, start to resize it and see what happens, right? Do I like that this scrolls over here? Do I want it to roll down? This is the final example, so this is how I've decided that I liked it. Again, there's those internal client and developer conversations. But you know, your client might say, no, I want it to work a little bit differently. This gives you the ability to have someone go in and say, yep, this works well, or I want to be able to make changes. Okay? So it also gives you the ability to test it really quickly. Very good. All right, so we've tested it in the browser. Build the functionality in Drupal. And in this case, I'm going to use a module called Paragraphs. And so what Paragraphs does is it allows us, it's basically a replacement for a giant body field. If you've ever had a client who said, I have all this content. I really like to be able to put an image here, and then a slideshow here, right? And then a video a little bit else, but I want content in between all those things. That's really hard to do with the body field, and it's hard to control the markup to make sure that it renders the way that you as the designer and you as the front-end developer want it to. Paragraphs gives us the ability to make these little chunks of reusable widgets that we can then roll out. So you as the front-end developer have the ability to control the markup in the CSS, but you give the client the ability to control their own content and edit it in there. So let's take a look at what that would look like on this guy. I'm not going to actually build out the paragraphs because we don't have enough time, but I will show you what the end example looks like. So here is the paragraph right here, and all it does is here's my example code and here's my example content. All right. Step 5 is to figure out the template name in Drupal. Anybody was in here in this room in the last session for the Twig, for the Twig talk, right? I'm going to skip over this because just go watch that session. It was awesome. Okay? So yeah, take a look at the session that was here. It was the Twig recipes talk that was in here last time. So figure out the template name in Drupal. Basically, it will once you turn on Twig debugging, it will give you these examples that you can then take a look at. And if you want to learn more about that, all these sessions are being recorded, so you'll be able to go and watch that Twig recipes one from the last time. All right, and that's the link to turn on debugging in Twig templates. So we're going to pull the component from the component Twig template out of pattern. We're not going to pull it out. We're going to connect it. We're going to make the connection between the Drupal 8 theme and the Pattern Lab theme. And how we're going to do that is by embedding the Pattern Lab theme into that file that we just created whenever we were looking at the Twig debug. So we're going to overwrite that paragraphs code default implementation with our own implementation, which pulls in Pattern Lab. And this is the part where we make that final connection between the two systems. And so now we're already sharing the final generated CSS file between the two systems, and now we're pulling in that final file into our Drupal 8 theme. So now we're going to whatever Pattern Lab gives us as the markup, we're going to receive as the Drupal 8 markup. Okay? So we're going to walk through this a couple more times. But I wanted to check and see if there's any questions. I also want to check and see how I'm doing. Okay. Questions? Okay. So let's go. Quick break number 2 for buzzwords and terminology, because I introduced a lot more buzzwords, and I want to make sure to go back and review those. And I want you to be thinking about if there's anything that I said. NPM. What is NPM? You know, if there's anything like that, I want you to catch it at the very end here and let me know. So. Paragraphs. Paragraphs is a Drupal module that allows us to create small, chunkable widgets of content that a content editor control. They can drag them, move them to different ordering, however it is that they want the thing to show up. SCSS or SAS. This is pronounced SAS because originally the files ended in .sass. Now they end in .scss, but we still call it SAS. And SAS generates the final CSS file for us that's shared between these two systems. And it makes the BEM naming structure easier to implement. So what's BEM? BEM means block, element, and modifier. I've already started introducing some of that terminology when I was talking about namespacing. So paragraphs-code was the block, and the element was the caption inside of it, right? So, and the way that the name structure works is block underscore underscore element. And then we're going to talk about modifiers here in the next example. Twig is the HTML templating in Drupal 8. In Drupal 7, this was using a system called PHP template. Because of this change, this is what makes this syncing possible, because they both use the Twig naming structure, or the Twig system, to be able to generate markup. So the obvious question is if you have a Drupal 7 site, should you be doing this? Anybody have an opinion?
Probably not.
Probably not?
It probably depends on whether you're planning on moving to Drupal 8.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah. Yeah, it's like anything, right? Maybe, I don't know, right? But I would argue that the benefits of, if your choice is Drupal 7 and Photoshop mockups, I'm going to make the argument that the answer is yes. Because you're going to get all the benefits of being able to mark things up, to be able to test things in the browser in a componentized way. And to me, that's worth the effort of rebuilding all of those templates in PHP template in Drupal 7. So that's what you'd have to do. You wouldn't get that automatic syncing. You would have the syncing where the CSS is shared, right, between the two systems, but you're going to have to go into PHP template and rebuild what you just did in Twig. It's a really good point about if you're ever moving to Drupal 8, because if you are, then it makes tons of sense, because now you've already built all of your Twig templates, and you have those ready to rock and roll, right? So when you go over to Drupal 8 and start to build out your site, you have tons of it ready to go, and now all you have to do is go back and do all that embed stuff. So it's a really good point. All right, NPM, it comes from Node.js. The important thing here is you don't need to be a Node.js expert. I am not a Node.js expert. NPM comes with Node.js, get Node.js installed, and then you'll be able to run those NPM commands. And those are important because that's how you spin up Pattern Lab on your local environment. So any other buzzwords that we should go over quickly? No? Okay, good. So let's take a look at the second component. And the second component is we're going to show images in the writing posts. So before we wanted to show code examples in the writing posts. Now we want to show images in the writing posts. And so this is going to be, I wanted to do this, as the developer and the client, I guess I wanted to do this so that I could build something that I think I might actually see in future builds, right? The clients might ask for, things the clients have asked me for in the past. So we're gonna create one image component that gives us the ability to create a left image, a right image, and a center image. And we're gonna use one component to be able to set all this up. So what was step one? Step one was understand the need for the component. So let's go back to these three things. What are the different parts of this component that's shared between all three of those examples?
Image and text. Image and text.
Yep.
The title.
Yep. Exactly.
And the caption of the image.
Right. Precisely. So these guys, that's a really good point, and I want to make sure to highlight all of those. This text on the right-hand side is actually from a different component. So this is from the text component, and then the image just floats onto to the right-hand side. So really, only we're talking about is exactly what's right in this little square. And this top right here, the top, that's the title for the node. So that's that would be its own component as well. So we're just talking about exactly what's right in here, and you guys got all of them. So we have the image, we have the caption, we have the byline. Hidden in here is also a link. If I had a byline that's from somebody, like it was on Flickr, I don't know. I wanted to be able to link to them to give them credit. So hidden inside that is also a link that we could click to find that person to say thank you. So that's the system. We also have the different variations on that system, where it's left, it's right, or it's big and it's center. So step two is to create the component in Pattern Lab. What we're going to do, what we're taking a look at, this is going to be pretty similar to what we did before. We namespace it with paragraphs image. We have the elements that are underneath it. Okay, these are the different parts of the system that we just talked about. And what we're going to introduce here is this idea of style modifiers. So remember BEM, I said, was block element modifier. And so the element is underscore underscore element name. Modifiers are dash dash modifier name. And so what happens here is if we pass a style modifier, I'm going to go ahead and add a paragraphs image dash dash, whatever that is. So dash dash left, right, or what I'm calling hero. Okay. So again, this is in Pattern Lab. Let's take a look at the Sass file. We have namespaced it with paragraphs image. we've introduced here where this will get rewritten with paragraphs-image, and we've introduced the style modifier for when it's left. And so that's when I start to float things over to the left, float things over to the right, depending if it's right. And then if it's center, we don't do any floating. But we might have some other things that we want to change. We have the elements inside. And again, these elements can even react to the style modifiers as well. All right. So that's what we have. That's what we have there. And again, this is going to create a really flat CSS file that doesn't make any assumptions about where this component lives. This component worries about itself and what's inside of itself, and that's it. This example JSON file, we're just going to pass some content to it and test the pattern in the browser. So let's go back, make sure we're in Pattern Lab, and we're going to take a look at the image. So here we have an example image. We can resize it, we can play with it, see how it works. You can also, so these aren't going to quite work because they're reliant on the content area being small, but you can also then create the examples of left or right. So it floats to the left. I think the other one doesn't quite work. But the point is that you can then create one component, and then you can start to test against those different variations by passing that new style modifier to the different systems, right? So test the pattern in the browser. We're going to say, yeah, we got it the way that we want it. So build the functionality in Drupal. Again, we're going to use paragraphs for this. Paragraphs, again, gives us the little chunks of reusable widgets in context. So if we go back and take a look at this guy and edit it. So here's our paragraphs image. And here's our image that we've uploaded. We have alternative text, the URL and the link text, and here the caption. So here's another good point, is the caption is optional. That's part of the system. As well as the byline is also optional as well. So that's another little bit of things that we have to account for whenever we build out this system. And here's where we give the client the final ability to decide if it's left, right, or hero. What kind of style modifier do they want to pass? All right. But my question to you is right now, we've implemented this. Will this look like our pattern at this point? There we go. Yes, exactly right. So at this point, we're using the default template that paragraphs image that the paragraphs module gives us. So it's doing its own markup, and that its own markup is relying on its own set of CSS selectors. So it's not going to quite look right. All the pieces will be there, but we still got to hook everything up exactly right. So that brings us to our next section, which is the theme function, where we start to hook all these pieces together. So what the theme function allows us to do is it allows us to grab the value that we just defined, left, right, or hero, pull that out, and set it as a variable that we're then going to pass to the Twig template.
Why wouldn't that be in content?
So I'm really glad that you asked this. And as I was going through this 2 days ago, I thought, do I really need this preprocess function? And I don't think I do. But I left it in here because it's an example, and I also think that it's really important to show that this stuff, there are multiple ways to implement these things, right? And I wanted to go back and test it and see, and I didn't get enough time to. So the point is none of this stuff is perfect, right? And I'm honestly very, very glad that you asked that, because I was asking myself, do I really need that? And I don't think I do. All right. So figure out the template name in Drupal. So pull the we've done this where we turn on Twig debug, we look at the source, we see what Twig debug gives us, and we pick out the appropriate theme name, the appropriate file name, so that we override what paragraphs module is giving us. And pull the component Twig template into the Drupal theme. So this is where we embed that paragraphs image, and we pass along the style modifier. To answer the question that you were asking, couldn't we just write content dot whatever the name of that field was, and then field value? And I think we could, and I got to test that. So if we can, the slides are publicly available, and you got to change it to the key.
Otherwise it's going to be the label.
Oh no, field value.
Oh.
I'll get to that in a second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is fun. This is another one of those assumptions that I'll come to at the end. But yeah, good, really good point. Field value. That saved my bacon a couple of times. All right. So that's how we make that connection. So what we're doing is we're passing that style modifier over to the Twig template, which creates a new class name for us. And then in the CSS file, we're paying attention to that class name and then making things change. So that's how we have one component, but introduces 3 different variations. Actually, multiple different variations because each caption could be on or off, and each item of the image byline credit could be on or off as well. Any questions on the second one?
Is that embed command, if just adding pattern lab make that available, or is that a typical Drupal command?
That is a typical Twig command that comes out. Yep, Twig gives us that ability. There's also one thing I want to highlight here, which is this block. So if we go back really quickly and take a look, we created a block here where we include the default one coming out of Pattern Lab. Whenever you create a block, you can overwrite everything that's inside of it. So here, if byline, all we're going to do is put in that byline URL and the byline text. But if we create a block, it allows us to change everything inside of that block element. So once I come back here and I pass a new block to it, everything that's the field figure image, the value of that, no label, right? The value of that will then get piped over to fill up that block. Why was this useful? Well, for me, if I wanted to in how the things are viewed, if I wanted to change the field formatter, I can change that, and I don't have to go and write a bunch of new templates to do it. And that's one of the things I learned. We'll talk about at the end. Some of the things that I learned going through this process. Any other questions on the second one? Okay. So the third component is going to be very similar to the second component. The difference is we're not going to talk about paragraphs anymore. We're going to talk about views and view modes specifically. So the third component that we're taking a look at is I want to create, again, 3 different variations. We have a hero one at the top, and you'll notice that this is orange. And you'll also notice that this bit sits on top of the image. Now we have a regular one, and it sits below the image. And the whole thing is clickable over to the final node. This is, think of it like a blog roll, right? It's just like a basic blog listing. And then on this other page, I wanted to make images optional, so just the text. Is this the best design decision? I don't know. I didn't have a designer on my team, right? It's just the client and the developer. So regardless of whether or not it was the best design decision, this was a decision that the 2 of us decided to go with. So we have the ability to link over to the final node, and we have similar things. So what was the first step in component? Building out components. Chris? No? Yep. What's up, Jen?
To see if you need it.
Yep, exactly. So understand the need for a component. So system level thinking. So what are the parts of the system that we need to build out here?
The image.
The image. Okay. What else?
The footer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This little bit of text down here. The title. What's optional? The image is optional. Yep. Exactly. So there's a good question about the byline. I don't know why I didn't include a byline. Oops. I didn't. It wasn't part of this. I don't know. The designer missed something. We'll blame the designer. Okay.
About the subtitles.
The subtitles? Yep. And the subtitles are required or optional? Yep. Exactly. So that's the part of all. That's our system. And those are the 3 different variations that we're going to build. So again, we've done this. So create the component in Pattern Lab. So this is going to look very similar to the one that we just did, where we namespace writing card. We introduce the style modifiers, okay? And we have the elements that are underneath it that allow that to happen. Again, I'm doing that block trick to be able to overwrite that image so that I can just take everything that Drupal gives me, because I'm not reliant on any of those CSS classes or any of that markup to do my styling. I'm just reliant on this guy right here. We have the Sass file. This looks very similar to what we just did. We have the namespace with writing card, and then we have the hero modifier, and then we have the elements inside. The example JSON file, this is just where we're piping in example content. And so test the pattern in the browser. So we're going to go back and take a look in Pattern Lab. And let's go to the right section. I'm sorry, writing card. Okay, so here's the writing card. Here's the default one. And we also have the hero, which goes right here. So one thing I want to show you, because it's a little bit hard to see here with these examples, is why I believe that it's really important to test things in the browser. So if we take a look at this, we take a look at the hero. This is the final one. And I make this small. My original, the designer, originally wanted this to be a little bit transparent and on top of the image. If you notice, if we make this really, really small, what's going to happen at this kind of a resolution?
It goes below the image.
Right. It goes below the image. If it didn't, it would be on top and we wouldn't see any of the image. So when I first started doing this, when I first started building this out, it sat on top. And I went, oh, that doesn't work, does it? Right? Even I could do that. This crack design squad that I had, right? So I said, okay, at these lower sizes, I need to be able to drop it below the image. And then a little bit later on, I can bring it and put it on top. All right. So to me, this is why it's so important to be able to test in the browser, because we cannot realistically expect a designer to think through all those variations, right? And this one is kind of straightforward. You know, there isn't a whole lot going on here, and we build stuff every day that is significantly more complex than this, right? Being able to find that in the browser is what introduced. Here's my example component. Here's how I think the thing should work, but I need to test it to make sure. And once I started testing it, I realized, no, it doesn't quite work, and I need to be able to go back and fix it. Well, I was able to fix it really quickly in Pattern Lab, and then roll that right out to Drupal 8. Okay. All right. So test the pattern in the browser. Build the functionality in Drupal. In this case, we're going to use views, and specifically, we're going to use view modes. And if you haven't used view modes before, what you're doing is each part of your content can have multiple different variations of how it's displayed. And Drupal uses view modes to be able to do that. So if you haven't used view modes before, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create lots of view modes that's available for any content type. And then we go into the writing content type under display, and we turn on each one of these view modes for this piece of content. And so what's the important part here that I want to make is that we're making a one-to-one connection between a view mode and a variation of that component that we created in Pattern Lab. All right? But the point is all three of those still use exactly the same item in Pattern Lab. So if we ever go back to Pattern Lab and make changes, we can consistently roll those back out to all the items in Drupal 8 that are using that same component. All right? So figure out the template name in Drupal. We did this with Twig debug. Pull the component into the Drupal theme. And again, we made that one-to-one connection between view modes and variations of that style. So here's the writing card. This is the default one. This is the blue one, the smaller one at the bottom. And we don't have a style modifier, so it's using the default, right? I debated about making sure that a style modifier would be required. So pass a default, pass hero, pass whatever you need to do. I might go back and refactor that. And the cool thing is if I go back and refactor it, I can roll it back out to my Drupal 8 site pretty quickly. So here's the hero where I'm passing the style modifier. And so the key thing with this one that I wanted to introduce is here we're hard coding it, right? We're saying this is part of the template now. We're not giving the ability for the client to be able to do it. We're deciding on our own when we want to introduce these variations. And that's completely fine. You can totally do that. And then here is the text-only one that is exactly the same as the first one, and we're passing the image. So the question becomes, how does the image go away, right? If I'm passing the image, why is the image not showing up? And the answer is I just went into the part in Drupal. I'm not going to do it because I think we're a little bit behind on time. I went into that view mode in Drupal and just took the image and hid it. So that way it wasn't showing up. So that view mode specifically is not even passing an image along. So that's how I introduced those three different ones. Go ahead.
It's not worth it maybe to apply the view mode as a style modifier rather than having a separate template for each one.
Passing the view mode as a style modifier. Oh, well, in a way that's what we did. Unless I'm not asking the question. unless I'm not understanding the question
Like,
correctly.
You have a separate, like the non-text version, you're not passing the style modifier at all.
So I'm not passing the style modifier because I'm using the default styling, but I needed the separate view mode to hide the image for this one, whereas the first one has the image.
Not in the render.
I'll go back. Okay, let's go back and take a look at this because I think it's probably worth it to take a look at. So make sure you're logged in. Did it really just go away? Okay. So let's take a look at this. So structure, content types, and writing. Manage display. So what I did was for the default card, I have an image. And for the text only card, I hid the image. And so each one of these, I'm going to use them with different view modes so I can introduce those templates independently. But you're right. Could they use the same template? Oh, I see what you're saying. Could they use the same template and just hide that? Yeah, they totally could. Yep. See, example. We all learn, right? You're 100% right. Yep. Good point. Very good point. So yes, you don't need the extra one because I was thinking you needed the extra one because I needed to overwrite it to make sure that it didn't show up. Probably because I was going to try to hide the image in a different way originally. Yep, you're 100% right. So we only need two templates here, not one. Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So what did I learn other than what I just learned right now? Okay. Wrong assumption number 1 is Drupal would be the test area for real content. I thought that I would be introducing the kind of text dummy content in Pattern Lab, and then once I got over to Drupal is where I'd test my real content. If I were to do this again, I'd put real content into Pattern Lab. And there's 2 primary reasons for doing this. The first is if I don't put the real content into Pattern Lab, I'm going back to the things that I was railing against at the very beginning of the talk, right? Which is that Photoshop mockups a lot of times only get lorem ipsum, right? So I wasn't following my own best practice anyway. I think this is incredibly important to put real content into Pattern Lab if your Pattern Lab cannot perfectly sync with your implementation. So if you're using Drupal 7, if you're using some other system that I don't know about right now that doesn't perfectly sync with Pattern Lab, because you can apply Pattern Lab to anything, right? It doesn't have to be Drupal 7. I just wanted to use it to hook everything together. If you can't make that perfect syncing, it's really important, it's really critical to get real content in there because that's when you're going to see when your assumptions break. And your assumptions will break. It's your responsibility to find those breakpoints before they get out into the real site. Real site. That was wrong. They're all real sites. Before they get out into what the client ultimately has to use and work with on a day-to-day basis. Okay? The next wrong assumption was I wanted to provide every template that Drupal would use. For the people who were in the talk in here before, 148 templates, another thing I learned, 148 templates in this stable theme. I didn't want to write 148 templates. I learned that pretty quickly, right? So what I ended up using was I used that block section to be able to replace everything. So when in that image one, I decided that I wanted to try to use the responsive image module instead of the default image module. If I had decided to write every single template, I'd have to go back in and now make every single one. And what's the payoff? I don't think that there's a payoff. So what I used was the block section to be able to pipe in rendered content into that area to rewrite that entire section. So sometimes I just want to pull a little bit of the value, a little bit of the text and render it. And other times I wanted to be able to show that entire section. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure because I wanted to make sure if there's any questions. I'll get to it. Okay. Wrong assumption number 3 was I thought that I'd be theming a lot of views with fields because that's normally how I would start with views. I just put a whole bunch of fields in there. It turned out it was a lot easier for me to be able to do things by using view modes. So my views just call content that give me view modes of my nodes, right? Is this going to work in every example? No, but it worked for my example and it made my life a lot easier. All right, so let's review the goals of this project quickly. Approve the design in the browser, not with the Photoshop rendering. Did we achieve this? I would say yes, we did. Front-end style guide perfectly in sync with production. Yes, we did that, definitely. Publish the front-end style guide publicly? No. I haven't figured out. Honestly, I was so excited to give this talk for you guys, that I didn't get, that's my excuse, right? I didn't get to figure out how to automate this stuff. What I would love to do is to be able to push up a commit and have some sort of a system regenerate my pattern lab for me. I just haven't figured that out yet. We'll get there. A bunch of resources that are available to you. I'm going to gloss over these because I think we only have 5 minutes left. The required Drupal's module. There are 2 required Drupal's modules that we're using. Okay. The first one is component libraries. This is what allows Drupal 8 to be able to talk to a different folder to pull those pattern lab files in. If you don't have this, Drupal 8 says if it's not in the templates folder, I don't want it. So you need that module. Twig field value is what I was using for that pipe to be able to pull out just the field value so that I didn't have to sit there and fight with it because I fought with it. Right? Saved you 2 weeks. Good job. All right. Drupal 8 theming initiative. If you're interested in this stuff, and I really hope that you are, I hope that I've made this interesting for you today. You can get involved with the Drupal 8 component theming initiative. This is an amazing way to learn. Other people will help you. The point is that we don't have this stuff figured out, right? Drupal 8 doesn't perfectly support component theming. We are all struggling and trying to figure this stuff out. There's just some of us who have struggled just a little bit longer, that's all. Okay? So get involved if you want to learn this stuff, because not only will you help Drupal 8, you'll help yourself at the same time. Again, there's the Drupal Twig Slack channel. This is a great way to even just snoop. Okay? Sit and watch what other questions other people have, because chances are you're going to have that same question. That's exactly what happened to me. So there was one day where I think it was that pre-process thing that we were talking about, and someone had asked that exact same question, and I went, that's amazing. It's exactly what I needed. I didn't even have to ask for it. So this is a really good resource. One note here: there is an official Drupal Slack channel. There is also a Drupal Twig channel. I don't think it's to cause conflict. I just think. I don't know, maybe Drupal Twig was before the official channel. I'm not quite sure. I don't think the front enders are trying to be standoffish. It just so you know, in case you get into the official Drupal channel and start talking in the Twig channel, and where is everybody? The front enders are over on this one. I'm not sure why. Okay. I'm going to skip the rest of these because you can completely go through them and take a look at it on your own. Lots of stuff to read. But I want to end by saying thank you. And I genuinely mean this. Thank you all for coming here today, because this is your faces that I've been thinking about for the last 2 months as I've been building this out and trying to figure out what these slides are. And it's your faces that have made me go back and think, I don't like how I implemented that. I need to go fix it. And now I get to go fix some more stuff too. So thank you very much. And thanks for coming here. And I want to hear your questions. Okay.
I know there's a theme, the Gesso theme that's done by one of the do a lot of pattern lab integrations. I'm wondering if there's kind of like an overlap in how they're both the theme between both doors.
With Gesso? Yeah. I've heard of the Gesso theme. I haven't played with it. The question was, does this Gesso theme have a lot of overlap with what I've done?
I think it does.
Probably. Yeah. I went with the phase 2, the pattern lab starter. I'm sure the concepts are similar. And what even might be cool would be to go play with both of them and figure out what you like out of each one, and then make your own and then pull it all together. Absolutely. Any other questions?
Different model that's being kicked around where I work right now is that the style guide sits on GitHub, for example, and it's more like an API where you would have your Drupal site over here calling it instead of having that pattern lab in the Drupal theme structure.
Okay.
Have you thought about that at all?
So the question, you said the pattern lab lives independently?
Yeah.
Outside of the system? So pattern lab, by default, is not something that's tied into Drupal. We've made it tied into Drupal here. Have I thought about externalizing pattern labs so that way it's external and then kind of gets pulled in as a dependency to the theme? I think that's something I'm going to have to start thinking about if I ever want to automate the front end style guide and make it available publicly, right? Because here, this is all within all the rest of my Drupal stuff. So how do I pull this out? I think I'm going to have to struggle with that when it comes time to actually trying to achieve that final goal. Yeah.
You could define the end, so you're in like King's Custom XIAO or whatever.
Yep.
But like you could define where you run the build process.
Oh, okay.
You could put it in like a root folder called like style guide.
Oh, okay.
Instead of putting it in a root folder right next to it.
That's brilliant.
Right.
I'd have to play with it. It could
I
be.
think you should do
Yeah, so
one.
the statement was if you were to externalize, I'm repeating this for the recording. If you were to externalize the pattern lab, could you put it doesn't have to live in the theme, could it live somewhere else entirely, like perhaps in the root, and then just pull it in using that component libraries module? Certainly, perhaps, right? Like that would be pretty cool, and if it works, it's worth a try, right? Yeah, that's really cool. 20 seconds. No? Get out early. Thank you very much.